Glember, The Tale of a Monster. Written, recorded, and illustrated by A.K. Brookman. Table of Contents. Chapter 9. The Firethorn Beetle. Day 25. I had been rocking back and forth for a long time before I had the strength to move. My confounded mind wrestled here and there with thoughts as I tried to make sense of the reality around me. I was being carried on the back of a creature. Glember was leading it down a tunnel. At times, glowflowers would reveal partial scenes or shadows before I was bathed in darkness once again. I was in no pain, I realized, feeling over my arms and the upper part of my legs and waist. The contraption was yet anchored to me, and I lay atop it, although something had been wedged between its rough surface and my back, thwarting the discomfort it should have gifted. The contraption itself was tied to the creature, although a second thick rope encircled my waist, and in this way I was held securely in place as it traveled. Why had I not slain the gargoyle while I had the chance? I could have drowned the thing while it was yet weak. I could have shoved it into the depths when the snake-eating fiend came to collect its corpse. Stories of failed attempts resulting when someone was kind enough to let another go free were favorites to be circulated by the warmongers who bowed before the throne of hatred. They were mere tactics used to push men to kill who wished to instead love. And yet, I found myself in such a position. I wondered if it was so bad to die for what was right rather than to kill for what was wrong. The tunnel's passageway opened up to a larger cavern now, and Glember muttered something I could not make out. The beast carrying me must have understood the command because it came to an abrupt halt. I fancied I could hear rushing water in the distance. Perhaps it was moving wind. In comparing the echoic sounds preceding this chamber with what I could hear now, I guessed this chamber to be quite massive. Sound no longer came back upon the ear in repetition. They ghosted out into nothingness. Perhaps we were in the mouth of a cave and the night held fast around us. That would explain why it was yet dark. I was afraid to let it be known I was awake. Perhaps the details gathered would save my life. I would remain quiet. For a while there was nothing but silence. "I know you are awake, human," Glember said, breaking it. I wondered if I should speak or not. "You breathe differently awake," Glember explained, and I could hear that he was walking nearer to me. "I have something for you," he said. As he drew near, the area grew brighter. I saw that he had some of the glowflowers in one hand. In the other hand he held something very small. I could not make it out. "This is a Firethorn beetle," he said, holding it near my face. I could guess why this was so as I looked at the tiny creature. It writhed about, thrusting a barb out furiously, attempting to sting Glember's fingers, yet his gloves were much too thick to penetrate. "Forgive me," Glember said, as he placed it against the side of my face. The initial sting was incredibly painful, and I jerked my head aside in pain, releasing a scream. But that was only the beginning. The pain seared deeper into my flesh. It felt as though an iron spit was pressing its way through my entire face. I began to cry out in agony. How could something so impossibly small yield such infernal pain? My face felt as though it was on fire. My eyes began to tear, and I felt now as though my face was being branded. It went on for a long time, and I jerked about in an attempt to bring my hands up to protect it. And yet the damage was done. I could not stop the pain with my hands, despite the fact that they were bound with the chains of the contraption, and despite an absolute death were I to bring my hands up. I nearly did anyway. I nearly lost my focus and activated the contraption several times. I could hardly think due to the intensity of the pain, and it was a long time before it began to subside. I tried to spit at Glember. I cursed obscenities I'd never before put upon the air. I'd swore I'd slay him if ever I had the chance. Glember waited patiently. He said nothing. I could not see his face, but I was sure he was enjoying every moment of it. At last the pain began to dwindle. I was covered in my own sweat. I could no longer feel my face. It felt as though it had grown to 10 times its former size, and there was a constant dull throb to my entire head. My heart began to calm, and after a little more time, the pain subsided completely. Even the pressure and the throb subsided. I realized my entire head was completely numb. For all its former immeasurable pain, it was now gone. Glember leaned over me. "You will come to know that sting, human," he said without remorse. I began to struggle again. hoping to free myself. I would not take another sting from that creature, and yet I could not break the rope that bound me to what carried me. I remained on my back, facing the ceiling, unable to escape. "Listen," Glember said. "I will explain." I did not allow him to explain. I began to yell, to kick, to scream. Glember waited. He ignored my questions. He ignored my insults. He waited until I had lost the fuel of my rage. He waited for fatigue to settle down upon me, and then he began. "Ahead," he explained, "we will cross an area that the Firethorn beetle claims. This beetle will protect its home with much ferocity. There are countless beetles. Their colonies contain numbers too much for one to count in a lifetime, and there are many colonies. There is no way around them. We must trek through their heart. If too many of them sting you, and the venom builds up, your heart will stop beating, and you will die. It is not uncommon for—" Glember paused a moment, as though he was remembering something, or as though he was choosing words carefully. I could not decide which. "It is not common for death to happen here," he finished. "Some are very tiny, so tiny they can get through the holes in even these gloves," he explained, holding up the gloves. "Yet these tiny ones do not come to attack unless one lingers. We will move too quickly for these," he said. "Hopefully." Glember took in a deep breath and let it out. "Some place things over their bodies and try to make the passage quickly and fail for the weight and clutter. It is difficult to see there. I would not advise doing this. If you do not make this pass quickly, very quickly indeed, you will die. The small ones, they will find a way through your clothing, and you will surely die," he said. "No, we will have to make the passage with great speed. We will not linger. We will run the full of that distance. We will not stop. If you fail, if you stumble, if you go the wrong way, you will die." That said, Glember drew nearer. "We will take 100 stings as we pass through there," he said. "What?" I asked. "No," I said, shaking my head. "No one can survive that. No one could withstand that much pain." Glember was nodding his head. "It is not just the pain," he said. "That many stings take feeling away from your body, away from your limbs. When one cannot feel his legs, he is bound to stumble, and then he will die." He sat down beside me. "There is one way my ancestors have found to do this," he said. "We will capture, just as I have, several of the Firethorn beetles. We will allow them to sting us in 10 places. "No," I argued. I began to curse Glember and his ancestors, and again he waited until I was done. Then he resumed. "We will suffer that great pain for as long as you did. Then there will be a short time when we feel entirely numb. It will not last long. It is during that time of numbness that we will make our dash. We will be stung many times as we run, but we will not feel the pain while we are yet numb. When we make it safely, we will rest. We will have to rest. The poison of the countless stings will compound. Although we will have escaped the pain, we will not escape the numbing effect. We will collapse and lose our ability to move for most of a day. The venom will wear off. We will gain our feeling back. The stings will not pain us when this is done, and we will continue on our journey." "That is insane," I protested. "And yet it is the only way. If you go out there as you are now, and you suddenly take 100 stings, you will panic, you will lose your focus, you will lose your way. The numbness will take you there, and it will be too great a numbness to move. You will stumble, and then you will die. Instead of being stung 100 times, you will be stung countless times. Your heart will stop, and you will die suffering unimaginable pain." Glember stood then and walked across the room. "So," he said, with a strained voice, "we will feel 10 stings and live, not 1,000 and die." I guessed he was searching the earth for Firethorn beetles, that the strain of his voice was his bending down to catch them. I was right. "1," he said in the distance. "Only 19 more, human. Only 19 more." Day 26. Glember released the crab that carried me just before we set off. We gazed down on countless mounds that were the homes of so many Firethorn beetles. They took to air in clouds at times in an almost beautiful display. I say almost, for the emotion tied to these beetles in my mind. Had I not suffered the sting of these creatures, I might have enjoyed their fluid movements upon the earthy air of the great luminous cavern. It was indeed a long way to the other side. The tunnel Glember pointed out on the opposite side of the incalculably large chamber was difficult to make out. "Glember," I argued, "I don't think I am in any condition to run that distance. I don't think I can make it." "You will make it," Glember said confidently. "I will remove the pack and the chains." He stared off into the distance and was quiet for a long while. Although I heard his words quite clearly, I could not believe them. Was he actually going to remove the contraption? I could surely not run with it on my back. Neither the weight nor the chains would allow me to run. And yet I remained skeptical. I said nothing for fear my words would sway his decision. "Are you ready, human?" Glember asked at last. "Why don't you simply kill me here, Goggle?" I said. It was no question, but a flat statement. Glember stared at me without words a moment. "That is not part of my plan, human," he said calmly, "and I should explain something." He withdrew the container holding the Firethorn beetles. "Once they sting you, it will emit a scent that will alert the others. They will come in swarms. They will follow faster than you can run, and you will die if you try to run the other way." He pointed again to the far tunnel. "They will not go down that tunnel," he said. "They will not follow us there." He began to loosen the bindings on the container holding the Firethorn beetles. "So you see," he explained, "after you are stung, you will make it that far, or you will die." He patted me on the back. "I believe you will make it, human." I began to scream. It echoed through the chamber as a mad cry, echoing off stone and resonating the floor and walls with its fury. One by one, Glember brought the beetles out of his container, using them to sting us both in turn. He was sweating profusely, I recall, yet I cannot remember much else. I was in entirely too much pain. I remember him saying, just before he stung me with the first one, that I need not worry. He said the others would not reach us until we were numb. He said, "When the first one arrives, that is when we run, not before, not after. But as the first arrives, do not forget this, or you will surely die." I need not again describe the pain. I nearly went insane. A sting to my face, to each arm, twice to each leg, 3 to my torso. Every spot of my body burned as though I was on fire, slowly burning and blistering to an agonizing death, and yet there were no flames, no blisters, simply tiny specks where the stings were. At last the pain began to dwindle. I realized Glember was talking to me. I had forgotten where I was, or what had happened. "Get up," Glember was yelling. I looked around, dazed. "Get up," he yelled again. "Why?" I wondered aloud. Glember pointed into the distance, and I could see a fog rolling in toward us, and suddenly I remembered what was happening. It was just as he had warned. The Firethorn beetles were swarming toward us. I tried to stand, but fell twice in the process. I could hardly feel my hands and feet. Only dull thuds came with my steps. It was as though my bones alone had feeling deep within me. I could feel nothing else. "Are you ready, human?" Glember asked. I realized I was no longer wearing the pack. It was on Glember's back, although the chains were not attached to his wrists or ankles as they had been to mine. "Are you ready, human?" Glember asked again. I looked ahead. It didn't matter if I was ready or not. It was as though night was descending upon us as the hoarded swarms of the beetles stole away the light of the cavern in their charge. And then I noticed movement from the corner of my eye. A beetle was crawling along my arm, though I could feel it not. I looked to Glember, my eyes wide with fear. "Run," Glember said. It was the most serious expression he had ever cast me, and yet it was somehow calm at the same time. Glember began to run. He charged direct into the storm of beetles. He disappeared into them. I wanted to close my eyes and follow, but I could not close them for fear I would not be able to run. I could scarce feel the ground as my feet struck the stone. I took a deep breath and began to scream as I lunged forward. As the swarm slammed against me, my movement nearly ended. The force of their countless bodies smacking against me almost ended my rush. Although I could not feel them, the terror was real and intense. I could see them crawling over my eyes with only tiny glimpses between them. I had to brush my face over and over for the first few dozen steps, and then the clouds were behind me. Glember was ahead of me by many a stride. He did not panic or bother to brush the beetles covering his arms or legs or body. He brushed only his face back and forth as he ran, and after some time I began to do the same. It was as though Glember was the only light in that deadly chamber, and although he would ultimately be the death of me, I could not help trusting him here in this underground nightmare. I ran after Glember. I ran for my life, even if it was my death. Chapter 10. My Sister's Words. Day 27. "I don't remember what happened," I said groggily. My skin was red from face to feet. It felt as though my skin had been burned by the sun after a long day of work in the summer fields. It was much more bearable than the stings of the Firethorn beetles. "Neither do I," Glember said. "Neither do I." "How did we make it?" I asked, if neither of us recall. Glember nodded slowly. "No one ever remembers it all, human. The venom builds up. It numbs your thoughts as well as your body. If you make the rush many times, I am told you remember more each time." I'm agreeable with not remembering, I said, and Glember smiled. He tried to turn his head so I would not catch a glimpse of it, but I saw it. Glember, I said, as I managed myself back to my feet. He turned to face me. I was taken at how often he was in thought. I could no longer accept that he was simply plodding, or that he was simply quiet. I realized then and there that Glember was plagued by the past. He was not thinking, he was remembering. Human? Glember asked. He did not scorn me for speaking, but wanted to know my question. I think I was beginning to change him. Glember, I said, smiling slightly before my expression died away, for I could not help that. If you become my friend, how will you kill me? I asked. Glember did not expect it. He stared at me in that way a person does when he feels as though turning will be some kind of weakness, even though staring is awkward. He could not find the words to answer. I don't put that thing on friends, Glember said, as his eyes narrowed suddenly. Indeed, he had placed the pack back on me as I slept. I looked down at the chains, at the bindings on my wrists. Of course, I said, as I turned my gaze back up to him. But tell me, Glember, I said, taking a deep breath and relaxing my arms and the tension on the chains. How many days has it been? I asked. How many more days can I think of my children and dream that I am sleeping beside my wife? Now Glember turned away. He looked around, but remembered he had already gathered his supplies. It's been 27 days, Glember said, with a shrug. As for how many more days you have, he mused aloud, rubbing his chin and neck. That is up to you, human, he said, at last. Because I can end at any time, right? I asked him, moving my arms out to the lengths the chains would allow just before activating the mechanism that would pierce my spine and end it all. Glember turned around again, although he did not meet my gaze. You understand, he offered alone. I see, Glember, I said. I understand. Glember nodded and said, Let us then be on our way. Day 28. By midday on the 28th day, we had begun an ascent through the underground tunnels. It was tiring and at times treacherous. The earth became slick, and I wondered that the rains we endured earlier swept through here at one time, washing the stone smooth. I fell countless times as we made our way up the slope of the widening tunnels, and endured the rock as I fell against it, unable to brace myself for the fall with the compromising contraption. I was amazed to see that the many tiny stings I had received vanished as though I had never been stung at all. For such a paralyzing and fatal infliction, the effects of the beetle's venom were quite fleeting, at least for those who did not succumb in the rush across that dangerous chamber. Glember had grown quiet. He said only what was necessary, and I don't think more than a few utterances were offered that entire day. I guessed that he was showing his first signs of guilt for what he was doing, that in this way, perhaps I could change him. Still, I would not press the matter. My words would but stem his fury. I plodded along, and was relieved when we at last came to a dimly lit and widened tunnel. The breeze had been steadily growing stronger throughout the day, and I entertained that we would be to the surface soon. When it did not come after this or that turn, I began to have doubts that I would ever again see the sky, and yet we reached the surface at last. By that time, night had descended upon the lands, and the wind had become harsh. The breeze that cooled the sweat from the strenuous travel became less of a comfort and more of a threat. I wondered that I would freeze to death in its cold and punishing assault. We will camp here, Glember said, and push out early in the morning, he added. I said nothing, but fell to the earth, excited to rest my legs. Glember prepared a fire, and after some time he turned away from it to lean against a nearby stalagmite. I waited for him to fall asleep, jerking to wakefulness when the throes of weariness attempted to take me. He did not sleep. The embers of the fire drifted to nothingness, and the woods shifted from time to time, sending a scampering group of them across the rock. I was trying with all the strength left in my lids, with all the will for life, but the exhaustion of the journey left me spent and weak. While my limbs were strong and weathered, I had not the endurance of Glember. That beast, like a wild dog in a strange land, kept watchful eye and endless energy. What strength of his will was greater than mine to live? I kept asking myself, how could such a thing be? He had not tied the chains of my contraption to the wall or rock or earth, I kept telling myself. This would be my chance. Yet, as the night drifted on, I realized I'd not get far. How could I, near the brink of madness and fatigue? How far would the strength left unto me? Little more than enough to keep my lids wide. How far would it take me? I never learned that answer. The claws of the snapping fire and the dancing embers carried me off to sleep where I dreamed of my family. Day 29. My sister used to read her book all the time. That one, she said, was written by a dragon. She moved from a selfish girl to a loving woman, she said, and I attest because of that book. I remember my brother arguing with her one day about some dilemma, one of those old examples handed down for centuries, tricking men at each turn. Perhaps it was the ever-childlike question, would you reveal the hidden location of a friend to one attempting to murder that friend, or would you lie, and thereby expose yourself to the treachery of falsehood? It may have been another example, or a number of these. My brother had made an earnest attempt to trap her, when she suddenly responded that we owe nothing at all to a law or a rule, or to the words of another, but rather to people and nature, and that, as such, his arguments were not valid. She said, there is no such thing as a dilemma, except to those who feel that they can tell the future. My brother's smile vanished. My parents turned their heads and began to speak to each other softly, knowing that he felt suddenly insecure about his attempt to refute or belittle her. It was his desire to best her, or to prove something to himself or to others, I supposed, but it had come to an abrupt halt with her soft and empathetically toned words. I could see that she suddenly felt sad for him. I could see such anger in his eyes. He said nothing, did nothing, but it was spilling out of him. He was enraged and furious. He stood there with a smirk that shifted to worry and then to anger. He then looked perplexed, as though his mind raced here and there, trying at every turn without success. He could think of nothing else to say, and then it happened. He tipped over the great table, and everything went with it. He screamed as he did it, and then, as he looked about from one of us to the next, and down at the table, he didn't know what to do. He stormed off into another room, and nearly slammed the door, but stopped himself. He closed the door carefully. My father was furious, and stood from where he sat beside my mother. He was headed after my brother when my sister stopped him. "No, Daddy," she said. She took his hand, and looked in the direction of my brother. My father looked from her toward the door my brother closed, and back to her again. I remember their gazes came together, my father and sister. My mother had stood, but made no move. She remained motionless. My other brother and I looked to each other, and I remember thinking that I had missed or misinterpreted something, that something surpassed my understanding. I remember thinking that I wanted to read my sister's book, and yet I never did. I felt as though it would be like betraying my brother, but I've often thought of that day. My sister had no way of knowing it would provoke my brother in that way, and yet she remained loyal to him. I have often been proud of my sister, but never more than that day. She lived her words that day. How many of us can say this? Would Glember live his? Would I live mine? We left the tunnels and that cave behind come morning. I felt utterly defeated and broken for falling with sleep. I was convinced Glember's keen ears would discern when I slept, and took that opportunity to gain more sleep himself. One of these days, I swore oath, it would change. One day he would oversleep. I would wake in the night and make my escape. I consoled myself as we wrestled with the craggy path that it was a boon to fall with sleep while I remained unbound. Glember, perhaps without knowing it, was relaxing his guard. It was only a matter of time before I was free of this monster. My sister's words in that event haunted me throughout the day. It was an odd thing. I am certain it was the fact that I wrestled with my own predicament, that I likened it to a dilemma in which I wrestled with the odds, wondering here and there which of my attempts would relinquish from fate the greatest probability of me making it back to my wife and children. And yet I felt there was more to it than that. I have been travel-weary for some time. Mayhap with reflection I may make better sense of it. Mayhap you can, should another's eyes fall upon my words. This concludes part 7 of 17 of Glember, The Tale of a Monster. You're listening to the first book of the Meristherian Trilogy. Please subscribe if you like the content, where you'll have access to additional books. Feel free to support this channel by telling others about it. These books are free to listen to, as you know, and everyone's welcome here. Leave a friendly comment if you like. Again, this is AK. Thanks for listening, friends, and see you next time.